Welcome to the conference, Reformed in America. I'm Jody Lucero, pastor of the United Reformed congregation that meets just across the way in the other sanctuary. The church is called Providence Reformed Church. Many of you know of it, some of you don't. In any case, we are hosting this conference jointly with Grace Reformed Presbyterian Church, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church in Des Moines. We're very pleased to do so, very glad you could make it. Want to thank you all for coming out tonight, and just have a few words here before we really get going. The conference obviously has a historical focus, Reformed and Presbyterian Christianity, particularly in the United States, and our purpose here is to gain a better understanding of what it means to be Reformed in this country, gain some appreciation for our heritage, maybe see some of the opportunities as well as challenges that in God's providence we have faced over the last 300 years or so. We have two very fine speakers who will be sharing their insights with us, and we're very glad to have them. We want to thank them both, Reverend Alan Strange, whom I will be introducing in a moment, and Dr. Darrell Hart. Thank you to you men. And also a very big thanks to Redeemer Lutheran Church. This is their building, their whole facility, and they've been very kind to open up the place for us to use. A couple of things here very quickly. I want to just mention in introducing our first speaker, Reverend Alan Strange. I know him a little bit. I have had the pleasure as a minister in the United Reformed Churches in North America of having Alan speak to us as a fraternal delegate at our classis meetings, equivalent of a presbytery meeting, more or less. And we've been very edified by his addresses at those times. Tonight, he comes to us to give us a number of lectures, one tonight and a couple more tomorrow. And I will introduce him by just giving you a couple of the bits, which you probably are already familiar with. But he is associate pastor at New Covenant Community Church, the OPC congregation in New Lenox, Illinois. He's also the associate professor of church history at Mid-America Reformed Seminary in Dyer, Indiana. He has served on many committees for the OPC. I won't list all of those. You can see them there. And he's been very active as a churchman in that denomination. He teaches courses not only in church history at the seminary, but also on the form of government. And he has written a good deal on polity in the church, as well as the history of colonial American Christianity, Presbyterianism in particular, and he has served as moderator of the 75th OPC General Assembly in 2008. We're very glad to have him tonight, and let's give him a warm hand of welcome.
Thank you, Pastor Lucero. I would like to thank the consistory of this congregation, as well as the session of her sister congregation here in Des Moines, both of those bodies for this gracious invitation. It's good to be with you, and particularly to thank all of you folk for taking this lovely fall evening to come out to be here. My son and I left our hotel room and hotel at what we thought was plenty of time. There's a hockey game down next to the hotel, so we kept getting redirected and so forth. But we made it, and it's good to be here. It's also good to see my fellow churchman, Darrell Hart, here, and he made it from a little farther distance away than myself. So it's good to be here tonight with all of you. The talk here is titled "The Tumultuous Beginnings of American Presbyterianism," and I guess that's perhaps apt because Protestants are always tumultuous, but I suppose it's better than being part of a church that claims infallibility. That's a really heavy claim to try to bear. We don't claim that. We claim that the Scriptures are infallible, reflecting our God, who of course is holy, and He is without error, and His Word is without error, but His church, that body that Christ died for, that He gathers and perfects by the Holy Spirit throughout the earth, doesn't claim to be perfect. In fact, I often say to my history students, many conservatives like to have a sort of great man theory of history. We talk about where that comes from. And I said, and it's very important to look at the great men and women of the church. But the reason church history isn't reduced to Augustine and Anselm and Aquinas and Calvin and so forth is because if you look at all those eras, you see that what really emerges in the church as a whole is greater. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts because all of the players are at every point very fallible. In other words, what I'm saying is if God hadn't brought the church along and we've come along with great weakness, the one who we magnify is Christ, not ourselves. We magnify the one who is our Savior. But given all of our weaknesses and sinfulness, which you see when you study church history, given all that as a church, you can see God has brought us along. It's not even the great men and the great women of the church who really aren't in and of themselves that great. If you study church history from a Roman Catholic point of view and you look at the men and women, it's very much lives of the saints. And these folks are really quite, you read about these saints and you think, well, I guess I must not be one because these are remarkable folks. But that's not quite the approach we take. That's not quite the approach as Protestants. We're not forced to take that approach. We have a great Savior. We have a great Savior. And we're a ragtag band that He saves, and we're grateful for that. And so American Presbyterianism is a messy thing because we're a mess, but God is gracious to us. And so when we talk about the beginnings of it, and this I think is of some particular interest perhaps to those who are Reformed, for these talks, I understand that Presbyterians are in their theology Reformed, and Reformed folk are in your polity Presbyterial. We all understand that. But when I say Reformed here, I'm going to mean those who come out of that tradition, particularly of Calvin and the churches on the continent. And when I say Presbyterian, I'm going to mean those who come out of Scotland particularly, and those churches that came to America and that are continuingly designated Presbyterian. So I'm not saying something funny. I'm not saying Reformed people aren't Presbyterians in their polity, and I'm certainly not saying Presbyterians aren't Reformed in their doctrine, but that's just a way we would use to distinguish that. So the beginnings of American Presbyterianism, where do we trace that back to? Well, we don't speak about that in a cohesive way until 1706. That's when the Presbyterian Church is reckoned as having its beginnings in this country, because that's when the first presbytery comes into being. And I say that because that's a little bit different approach than some in the Reformed world would see things. There were scattered Presbyterian churches in the colonies in the 17th century. You can think of a little bit of that in the South. There were, of course, in the South there were a lot of Anglicans, particularly in Virginia where that church was established. But you had some Presbyterians come down the valley there, Ulsterites coming down in the 1690s. In New England, of course, you had mainly this sort of Puritanism that was a congregationalism, that was an associationalism oftentimes, that had certain sort of Presbyterian flavors to it. But it's really in the middle colonies. It's in the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, that Presbyterianism flourished. And you had Puritans from Connecticut and Long Island who came down, and churches were founded in Newark in 1667, Elizabeth in New Jersey in 1668, in Woodbridge, this is all New Jersey, 1680, Fairfield, 1692. And you had in 1692 also the Presbyterian congregation meeting in Philadelphia in the Barbados Company warehouse, and Jedediah Andrews came as the pastor there. You're saying, well, you've got various Presbyterian churches here, but you say you don't have a Presbyterian church until 1706? Why is that? Well, the reason it is because you have these several churches in Philadelphia, which is really the cradle of American Presbyterianism. It's those several churches that come together and form, I mentioned Jedediah Andrews, and then there's Francis McCamey, who is in that region, and they're all part of forming the first presbytery. So until you have that regional church, until you have that formation in 1706, you're not reckoned as having the Presbyterian Church as such in America. The American church will, even at that, be from the bottom up, if you're thinking this is a top-down. No, it's going to build from presbyteries. In Scotland, just to contrast this, the church was born there in an instant, you might say. In 1560, remember back to John Knox, and by the way, this is tonight. I'm talking a little bit about Scotland, so I have this is my MacLeod tartan. This is on my father's side. So if you're thinking, this is an awfully garish sort of tie for a Reformed church and a Reformed gathering. No. This is my tartan. I didn't choose it. It chose me. It's a principle of election here. So it's like your family. Your family's your family, ever what they may be. But this is the tartan. So I wear that tonight just for that fun little purpose there. But in 1560, you had John Knox, who had made his way from Geneva, where he had been as part of the exile. Bloody Mary was ruling from 1553 to 58. She was trying to turn England back to Rome after Edward VI. She was trying to turn them back to Rome. And you had many reformers under Edward VI who fled to the continent. And this is where a lot of the crossbreeding occurred. It was Knox who called what he studied, what he had with Calvin in Geneva, the most perfect school of Christ since the day of the apostles. Now, Knox was given to hyperbole sometimes, but the point is that he had studied with Calvin, and he didn't always take Calvin's advice. For example, he wrote that infamous first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regimen of women, and he meant Mary Tudor, he meant Mary Stuart. And he writes that right when Mary Tudor goes away and Elizabeth in 1558 comes to the throne. Calvin said, don't publish this. Calvin, we think of Calvin as this pretty fiery sort of convicted fellow, and he was. He had a temper, all these sorts of things. But he was mild sometimes compared to Knox, I think. But Knox published it, and then he's going to try to make his way back up to Scotland to try to get a Reformed church there. Because he's learned from Calvin. He's learned from the continent. He had learned before then, but he's gotten a lot more. And so he's going to want to make his way back to Scotland. And Elizabeth won't let him come through. She won't let him come through England. You have to go around. You're not coming through my kingdom, having written that book. It was, he had a particular tenure when it came to public relations. So at any rate, he makes it up to Scotland. And in 1560, you have the Scots Confession. And you have the General Assembly, and that's the way the Scottish Church is born in that sense. It's a top-down sort of a situation. You start with this General Assembly because they have a church in place, and the whole Scottish Church as a national church is going to be organized at this point, and it's going to kind of move in and out of that. But it's going to be organized at this point along Presbyterian lines, because the same year they have the confession, the Protestant confession of 1560, the Scots confession. They have the first book of discipline, 1560. They revised that some, the 6 Johns, as they're called, John Knox being one, write that. In 1578, you have the second book of discipline. Andrew Melville, not related to Herman, but Andrew Melville and company will put that into place. And that's going to become very influential in a number of ways for the American church, particularly even for the talk we have tomorrow, because that second book of discipline sets forth some very key principles for what will come to be called the spirituality of the church, and that understanding and that doctrine. That's going to be very key to that. So, we always owe a lot to the whole Scottish heritage. But folks from there started coming over, but I'm contrasting a little bit about the way the Scottish church was sort of born in this top-down, starting with the General Assembly and all of this, confession, coming down, and when you come here to America in the colonies, you have scattered Presbyterian churches, particularly in the middle colonies, but you have it begin there in 1706. And then it's about 10 years later in 1716, 17, that you have several presbyteries in the area of Philadelphia coming together to form the Synod. And then it's another 12 years later that you have in 1729 what's referred to as the Adopting Act. What do you mean? Well, that's when they adopted the Confession of Faith and Catechisms and also parts of the form of church government, that whole panoply of documents. That's when they adopted them. So you're saying the American church for those years, those individual churches, and then even the presbytery and the synod didn't have the Confession of Faith in an official way until 1729? That's right, they did not have that. So we say, again, unlike the Scottish Church, which adopted the Westminster Confession of Faith in 1647, so you had the Westminster Confession was completed in 1646, the Scottish Church, as a church, the General Assembly of the Scottish Church, to be clear about that, adopts the Westminster Confession. See, the Westminster Assembly was not a church assembly. So you say, well, what do you mean the Scottish Church adopts it? Didn't the Scottish Church and the English Church, aren't they the ones who put this into place? No. The Westminster Assembly was called by the Parliament of England. It was called as a body, you might say a theological body, to advise the Parliament. So the Scottish Church had to adopt it as its own document. So that's an important consideration that has all kind of play throughout the period of time. But the Scottish Church in 1648, 1647 adopted it. The Parliament thereafter, the Scottish Parliament, ratified it. And just for you continental folks at this point, of course, the continental churches had earlier had a variety of there were lots of meetings for synods and bodies to put together documents. But what ultimately comes to hold, you might say, is the Belgic Confession of 1563. In other words, you might think of the Belgic Confession of 1561 and the Heidelberg of 1563 as, those were confessions and catechisms passed at those times. There were lots of confessions. Reformed Heritage Books, maybe it's out there. You could see the 3 volumes. I guess the 3rd volume hasn't yet been published. It's the 2 volumes that have been published. But of these 16th and 17th century confessions, and you might be surprised. You might say, wow, and I thought the 3 forms in Westminster was enough. I thought that was a lot, but there's all these confessions. Yes, these are ones that really get picked up. And at Dort, of course, Dort is the great synod of 16, 18, 19 that sort of puts these into place, the Belgic, and gives them the kind of authority they come to have, the Belgic and the Heidelberg Catechism. And Dort really becomes the model when Westminster meets, when it begins meeting in 1643. It's going to enter into a solemn league and covenant with the Scottish churches, so it'll be just an English kind of revision of the 39 Articles to becoming something for the English and the Scottish churches. But what they look back to at Westminster is Dort. They regard that as the model. And of course, it was international. England had representatives at Dort, all the countries. France was appointed representatives. It's just that the King of France said, they said to the king, can we go? He said, you may go, but you come back, your homes are dispossessed, you get nothing when you return. So they decided they wouldn't go. In other words, you lose everything. These are the kind of stakes at that time. But this was an international gathering, and so the international part of the gathering, though, dealt with the doctrinal issue with respect to the Arminians and the development of the 5 heads of doctrine and the refutation of the errors. When it came to the establishment of the polity, the international delegates were dismissed, and the Dutch delegates there then, of course, worked on the particulars of the church polity. But Westminster looked back to that as a kind of model. But all of that is to say, where that came to have focus and play in America was in 1729 when the Presbyterian Church, I'm tempted to say finally, is going to now adopt this. And you might say, why? Why not earlier? Well, this was due to several things, including the reluctance of some among them, particularly among certain sorts of New England Puritans, to adopt a confession. The conviction was among some in New England especially who were influenced in certain ways that God's Word is sufficient And confessions contradict that. They wrongly bind us. So we can't say God's Word is sufficient and have a confession. If we think it's sufficient, we don't need a confession. So there was that idea out there. And many in the colonies, of course, did not want to, they thought confessing this document from Westminster from the previous century, from the 1640s, that was a body advisory to Parliament. And they have establishmentarianism. And there are clauses in this that call for a church established by the state, and that's not what we want. And particularly, we don't want Erastianism, which is the notion that the state is over the church. Let me just say this about that. This notion of the state being over the church was a Protestant reaction in no small measure to the previous kind of claims, particularly that you get in the Middle Ages, of the Roman Church to be over the state. So you come in the Middle Ages, you come into the 13th century, and you have someone like Innocent III. He is making very overarching claims. Others had before, Gregory VII, but Innocent III, and then particularly Boniface VIII in 1302 in Unum Sanctum. But you have in this whole, the High Middle Ages especially, you have this claim, this papal claim that's been developing for some time, that the church is over the state. That the church is over the state. And, of course, you had in the Eastern Church, earlier on, you had the notion of, what place does Constantine have in this? But you had developed in the East, particularly, as opposed to the West. We're thinking the West is Rome and all associated with that. In the East, you had developed something called Caesaropapism, which taught that the emperor is sort of the first churchman, and the emperor is over the church. And the Bishop of Rome and many others in the West particularly said, no, there is no layman, there is no emperor who's over the church. Rather, the church is over the state. So it was seen as a kind of zero-sum game in the Middle Ages. Either you have a Caesaropapism in which the state is over the church, or you have Rome's claim in which the church is over the state. Now, of course, what the Reformers are going to say, what Calvin is going to say, but what also Luther is going to say, all the magisterial reformers, Zwingli, Knox, they're going to have broad agreement on this point. The church is not over the state, nor is the state over the church. They're both under God. Now, how they relate and work, well, therein lies the rub. The precise relationship between them. But all the reformers say, no, the church isn't over the state, nor do they think that the state is over the church. But what you have at the time of the Reformation, where reform is going on, there's this sort of fight that goes on. And I should be clear, there are some reformers who go in a direction, lesser reformers who go in a direction of Erastianism, but generally speaking, the church doesn't like that. The Erastianism is, again, as I said, it's this notion in a reform context that the state is over the church. But most churchmen understand that that's something to be resisted. That's not something to be embraced. Even if you have an establishment, the Scottish folk will say, yes, an established church is fine. But, that is to say, the state should give some kind of official support to the church. But it shouldn't be over it. King Jesus, you have that whole development, particularly in the covenanting movement, but King Jesus has the crown rights over the church, and the state is not over the church. The monarch of Britain is not properly over the church. Well, I don't want to get, that's about 6 lectures there I just gave in a few moments. Sorry about that. There's a lot there, I know. I'm just trying to tell you about the American situation, though. And in the American context, what you have in that context is folks saying, no, we don't want to adopt this confession in a way that either the church is established here or certainly not in a way in which the state is over the church. Although it's interesting that some of the New England folk opposed that because they had a kind of practical Erastianism. If you look at New England town life and church government, it's hard to exactly describe. In some respects, you could say the church is over the state in some of those places in New England. In other places, it depends on how you slice it. I mean, if you have to give a narrative of grace in order to be in the covenant of grace, and you have to be in the covenant of grace in order to be in the civil covenant, that is to vote, maybe the church is over the state. It's a pretty complex situation. But that's what you have going on in New England. But that's not what you have going on in these middle colonies. And in these middle colonies, now you have in New Jersey, all you good Reformed people are coming over, right? That's New York is New Amsterdam, right? And New York City, I was just out there. You bought it for $24 or something from some. I don't know if that was a good deal or not, but no. You have New Amsterdam there, so you have the Reformed there, and in New Jersey, you have these nice Reformed lines and veins, and you have the Presbyterians coming in there. Pennsylvania is a comfortable place because William Penn is a Quaker, and he allows some freedom and toleration. So up in New England, you've got a kind of Puritan where you have a kind of establishment of various sorts, as I just described. And then in these middle colonies, it's a bit of greater freedom there, and you have the Presbyterians coming in there. So what they did then, when they adopted this in 1729, they adopted the Westminster Confession with a general scruple against an established church. We could get into the details, but we don't have time. So we could say this from the beginning. In the American church, scruples are, I have this difference or this difference with the confession. Scruples were permitted with respect to subscription. It hadn't been the case in Scotland, for example. So in the American context, there's no Erastianism, no state over church, and no establishment. By way of contrast, just to say this for all the Reformed brothers and sisters here, Erastianism very much was prevailing in the Dutch church. After the Synod of Dort in 1618-19, you have all sorts of developments in theology, but in general, in sort of broader culture and history. You have the Enlightenment going on, because you're going to have the 30 Years' War right there from 18 to 48. Some speak of the 70 Years' War, in the Dutch context. But you have all these sorts of things going on, and you're going to start to have theological problems in the Dutch church. You're going to have theological problems, but because there is in the Netherlands very much Erastianism. The Estates General have to permit a synod to meet. You don't have a synod unless the government says, so you don't get lost, what's the Estates General? Your government's got to say you can. And of course, what's happening in this period is the Orthodox are wanting to have a synod. I mean, they're having, you have the consistories and the classes. They're wanting to have a synod to deal with issues that are arising, particularly things that are coming out of the Enlightenment that are undermining orthodoxy, things that are being taught, that the Bible is beginning to be openly criticized in some ways. Things are being, unbelief is being openly voiced. And there are ministers then, as you go on from the 1600s into the 17th, into the 18th century, and into the 19th century, you have ministers who are beginning to teach unorthodox things. And the Orthodox are crying out to the government, let us have a synod to deal with this. And as almost is always the case, except in rare cases, when you have this kind of a state over the church situation. Think of the book of Acts, okay? They're having these different controversies. And the Roman proconsul or some Roman leader hears the Jews saying this, and he hears Paul saying this, and in many cases they're like, you all sound the same to me. I can't tell the difference. Government rulers, even if they profess to be whatever, they often aren't very keen on really getting what these differences are. So what's going on in the Netherlands is the rulers are like, you all just need to cool it. Now, we're not going to, you call a synod here, it's going to be a lot of trouble. We don't need that kind of trouble. Just get along with each other. So you have some doctrinal differences. I can't tell the difference. I want peace. I want peace. So it's not until 1816, it's not until almost 200 years later that you're really able to call a synod in the Netherlands. All that time. And then, as that things start developing, quickly there, so that, you have in 1834, you have these bumps. 1834, you have the Aufscheidung, you have the Doleancy towards the end. You just have all these differences. In other words, it's sort of been held under. The free church movement is popping up. It's happening at the same time in the 19th century in Scotland, because you have in 1843 the disruption. We're going to see here in America, you have in 1836 and 37 the old school, new school. So in the 1830s and the 1840s, you have an international Calvinism on the continent, in Scotland, here in America, these sort of movements arising out of these main bodies, these movements arising saying, well, in the American Presbyterian context, the old school is actually larger than the new school. But these are all saying, we need to be faithful to the Scriptures, we need to be faithful to the confessions. But going back now to 1729, they allowed some scruples. The Dutch churches tended earlier on not to allow this either, but they had their own subscription controversies that are going to rise as a result of all these things we're talking about. As you might recall, as with the Lutherans, the whole question of, is subscription quia or quietanus? Is the Scripture, do you subscribe to the confessions because they contain the Word of God, or insofar as they contain the Word of God? Now you see the difference between those two, right? The because is a more strict form. Because they contain the Word of God, or insofar as, certainly sounds like I get to kind of pick and choose, or at least somewhat. So there were subscription controversies then that are going to occur in the 18th and 19th centuries, very much so in the Netherlands, on the continent more broadly. But they occur here from the beginning, because we take exception to the Westminster Confession in the American context, as I say, to the establishmentarian and anything that sounds Erastian. We take exception to that when we adopt this. And let me just pause and say this too. It sometimes gets mentioned by good Reformed brethren. I'm thinking of somebody in particular, is a good man, he's a good friend of mine. And he likes to mention, well, we Reformed we don't let any exceptions, and you Presbyterians allow these exceptions. Let me say something about that. The documents are very different. They're not the same. What would one allow an exception to the Belgic or the Heidelberg or the Canons of Dort? The focus of those is very soteriological and ecclesiological. The focus of the Westminster Standards are broader than that. The Westminster Standards in the larger catechism have details that you don't have in any of those. They also address things. They address the civil magistrate, they address marriage and divorce and remarriage. There's a variety of things that get addressed in the Westminster Standards. So I just think it's good to keep that in mind, that allowing some sort of scrupling with respect to the Westminster Standards. Now, I hate to say this in such a crowd, but the devil's in the details, obviously. What are you allowing? But allowing some sort of scruples in the Westminster Confession, which is the historical American position, doesn't mean the store is given away thereby. It depends on what you're allowing. I mean, you can look at the Princetonians, you can look at the way Hodge deals with this. And Hodge has a pretty full notion of subscription, but it's certainly not one that's it's not a strict kind that allows no scruples. Because that's just never been the history of the American Presbyterian Church, allowing no scruples. But as I'm saying, there's a certain reason too. The two traditions, the three forms of unity, are narrower in their scope and focus doctrinally than the Westminster Standards are. So you can't quite just compare them in that way. To say if you allow a scruple to the Westminster and you don't to the three forms, those are, or you shouldn't in either one. Those really aren't comparable, I think, in that specific way. Well, so this is what's happening there. There's also a crisis of ministerial education going on in the colonies at this time because, and it's going to lead to the forming of a couple of parties. This will be part of the forming of these parties of Old Side and New Side. This is already sort of going on. I mentioned New School, that's 19th century, but in the 18th century, from 1741 to 1758, you're going to have a division within American Presbyterianism called Old Side, New Side. Part of it is going to be, the Old Side is going to, and this, again, these are tendencies. Not everybody is for the same reason on any side always. These are complicated matters. But the old side has a tendency to a bit fuller subscription notion, a bit, we want to take the confessions seriously. Some of the New England types are New-Siders. They're not as interested in that, and they're particularly interested in, ministers need to be godly, pious men. And we're not interested just in doctrine. Some were less interested in doctrine. We're interested also in whether people, what their experience is as Christians, and how they live their lives. So you have these sort of differences coming here. And the Directory for Ordination of Ministers, which was followed by the colonial church, the American colonial church, as part of the form of Presbyterial church government coming out of Westminster, said this, that a candidate for the ministry is to furnish proof of what degrees he hath taken in the university and what has been the time of his abode there. And this proved problematic in the middle colonies because there were no indigenous schools in the middle colonies. So where Presbyterianism is growing up, what you had Harvard, 1636, up in New England, and you had Yale, concerned for liberalism at Harvard, being formed in 1701, but those are both in Massachusetts and Connecticut. You had south of there, you had William and Mary, founded in 1693. That's Anglican. You did have in the middle colony St. John's towards the end of the 17th century, but that's Catholic in Maryland. So you don't have any kind of indigenous institution in the middle colonies for the training of men. So their degrees had to come either from the north or the south or British institutions. So to remedy this deficiency, one man started an academy. William Tennant started an academy in Neshaminy, Pennsylvania, that was called, particularly by its opponents, it's always interesting how names like the Puritans, that's what the opponents call it, that's what they come to be called. Called it the Log College. That wasn't a compliment. It meant, this is no university, this is a log college. So they called it the Log College. That then becomes a proud badge later on by pietists anyway. But he really put it together to train his sons. Others began to send their sons, and others of these log colleges got developed in the middle states. Tennant also, I'm trying to link some things up together here for you. Tennant also tended to be warmly pious, and he embraced the Great Awakening, critical of some of its excesses, but he was embracive of the Great Awakening when it came in the 1730s and 1740s. So you have these two groups that are differing here in their approach to things. This old side, which doesn't particularly like the Great Awakening, it seems to be disturbing a lot of churches and established churches, which is more confessional, which is taking a certain approach here. And you have the new side, which is among the Presbyterians, it's never as full-throated as sort of a pro-Great Awakening in most quarters as it is in New England, for example, among the New Lights. There's some distinctions to make there. But largely liking the Awakening and believing that piety, personal piety, is very important. So what you have happening here is the Log College coming to be identified not only with this alternative way of educating, but also identified with the Great Awakening and furnishing men who are going to sort of form this new side, supporters of the Awakening. The Awakening, there's a lot to say there. I'll just say this about it. It was as a sort of Calvinistic upsurge amid broader developing Arminianism and Socinianism and the like. It's quite a mixed bag, you might say. But among the Presbyterians, the new side came to insist, what's going to be called the new side, came to insist that ministers testify to a work of grace in their hearts, and the old side to stricter confessional and church government adherence. The worst aspects of this, in, say, a new side embodiment, we're seen in something like Gilbert Tennant's notorious Nottingham sermon of 1740, titled, get the title here, The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry. And in the sermon, he clearly implies that his opponents, those who didn't agree with the Awakening, or him, really, in large measure, were unconverted Pharisees. So he said, you're unconverted Pharisees. A lot of our ministers are, or some of our ministers are, at least. Well, this exacerbated tensions. People don't like that for some reason. This exacerbated tensions, leading the Synod, now this is the Synod which had been formed in 1716, leading the Synod to forbid log college men from being licensed. So they're saying, men who have been to the log college, they don't meet the requirements. This is not a university education. They don't meet the requirements. New Brunswick Presbytery basically said, well, you can't tell us who we're going to license. That later became Machen's Presbytery, by the way. New Brunswick Presbytery, this is in New Jersey, licensed a log college man, and the Synod expelled the whole presbytery. The Synod said, okay, you're going to license the man, we're going to throw you out. So they expelled the New Brunswick Presbytery, which joined with some other presbyteries sympathetic to it, and there was thus the split. The New Brunswick Presbytery and other presbyteries that were sympathetic to it formed the Synod of New York and New Jersey over against the Synod of Philadelphia. So now you had these two synods, not that are sort of by church growth so much as they're opposing each other. Much of this began to heal fairly soon, though, particularly as the log colleges gave way to a school that had a lot of new side and old side, but a lot of new side influence. In 1746, the College of New Jersey, 1746. So these log colleges and other things kind of went into the formation of that. The first president was Jonathan Dickinson, who was rather favorable to the new side. That becomes Princeton University later on. This College of New Jersey will become Princeton University towards the end of the 19th century, takes that name. Around which old and new side would both unite later on. The new side charged the old side with impiety, lacking in religious experience, we say, not a fair general charge, even as the old side charge of laxity and ignorance, that was often what they said with respect to the new side, wasn't exactly always fair either. We don't have the time. I wish we did. I would read you from something I wrote some years ago, the particulars in a new side presbytery of what a man went through for licensure and ordination. And if this is laxity, our presbyteries and classes are really lax. This was a new side trials for ordination, and it was I just don't have the time. I mean, he had to prepare a Latin oration. He had to prepare sermons on, I'll just tell you this, 1, 2, 3, 4 different texts, not just preach a sermon. He had to preach 4. He was examined in the Latin and Greek languages, always Latin, of course, too. Later he's going to be examined in Hebrew. Briefly in logic, ontology, ethics, natural philosophy, rhetoric, geography, and astronomy. This is to become a minister. This is what, and it goes on and on. It's interesting there. The differences were often not as great. There were certain figures among whom they were greater. I mean, Tennant was a very polarizing figure. Gilbert Tennant was. The two sides come back together in 1758. So they're separated from 41 to 58 on terms favorable to both, as noted by Hodge in his constitutional history. It should be noted that as a part of all this, I should say this, that Gilbert Tennant repented in 1757, particularly expressing that in a communion sermon called Love to Christ, in which he was saying, I wasn't very loving in earlier years. Well, I have some things to say here about Jonathan Edwards, but I don't think I have time for it. Maybe Dr. Hart will. Dr. Hart is one of Edwards' greatest fans, so he might... that a good hearty laugh there. Edwards is just a fascinating character for some reason. Well, perhaps not. But just to give this tie-in to Edwards, I'd like to say more about Edwards, but I just don't have the time. He becomes the third president of Princeton. So you have Jonathan Dickinson, you have Edwards' son-in-law, who's married to his daughter Esther. Aaron Burr, Sr., yes. Aaron Burr is his son-in-law. This is Sr., so Jonathan Edwards' grandson is Aaron Burr, the scoundrel, who killed Alexander Hamilton and who was tried for treason and lots of other fun things. Edwards' grandson. But Edwards was the third president. Now, it's more symbolic. Edwards was only there for 6 weeks. So, I mean, he died. So, he died of smallpox. He took the smallpox injection. That was a big controversy back in the day. Cotton Mather, others said, you may take these injections. People thought you shouldn't take injections because you're trying to thwart God's will. And they said, no, this is all part of God's, He gives us wisdom, and you can't thwart His will. And he had it favorably at first, as they say, then it turned unfavorably, and he died. Apparently his last words were, don't take the injection. No, but he's there at Princeton, and his first pastorate in New York City, Edwards, was among Presbyterians. But Princeton became not only a Presbyterian center of learning, but a beacon for the nation. So you have those 3 presidencies, and then Samuel Davies and Finley, and then John Witherspoon, probably of those first 6. Well, he's the one who lives the longest. Those guys are dropping like flies. But you have John Witherspoon, who becomes very involved in the nation and the civic affairs of the nation, signing the founding documents. You may be familiar with all those things. The seminary, you might say, where does that come in? That's founded in 1812, so we just celebrated last year the 200th anniversary. But the seminary is founded particularly because the college had become so focused on the Republican, and I mean that with a little r, okay, the Republican concerns of the new nation. It was started by particularly New Side, really wanting to train ministers. But during Witherspoon's time and after, they became really focused, perhaps even more so, on sort of national affairs. James Madison went there, and he wrote the Constitution largely, and there was that focus. And Witherspoon very much had that focus. So I'm simplifying vastly, but part of the reason they wanted to start a seminary was at least the understanding that the college the focus isn't so much just on this training. It's as much training meant for the nation as it is meant for the ministry. And the Presbyterian Church was quite concerned with matters civil as well as religious during these times. It's the case that it, with the Calvinist Congregationalists, made up a good part of the American nation in 1776. Mark Knoll has, in one of his books, a little chart that shows you all the affiliations, and it's just striking how many Calvinists there are in one sense there at the founding. But that's going to go into decline, and it's going to soon be eclipsed. The Presbyterians will be eclipsed altogether in the teens and 20s by the Methodists, who not long thereafter, a couple decades later, are eclipsed by the Baptists. And what you really have, of course, is the country is opening up. The frontier is opening up. And you have particularly these Methodists and Baptists going out to the frontier. The Presbyterians retain their requirements for ministerial training, and 2 things there. So it takes longer for a man to be trained, and there's more involved in it. And to be frank, just sociologically and historically, when a man gets trained like this, he would often then prefer to serve among a more civilized type settled area than go out to the frontier. That was just the case. So you had, and the Presbyterians, they had some interesting ways of looking at this. They were a little bitter sometimes. You could hear that bitterness that would come through. Like one Presbyterian professor complained with respect to these other denominations that the Methodists, he said, would ordain any fool on a horse. And the Baptists would ordain the horse. So that a little bitterness there, I think, that they're making it out there on the frontier, and we're kind of lagging here. But they continued, Presbyterians in certain respects also, continue to have influence out of proportion to their size. There were a number of public officials, and among the educated, so did the Episcopalians. Though you didn't have a Presbyterian president until Andrew Jackson, which is quite interesting. I've done a lot of work in Hodge, and Hodge was no fan of Mr. Jackson. They're both Presbyterians, and But Hodge was a Federalist and did not at all care for Mr. Jackson. He didn't. It's interesting because I read one historian talking about this. I read a couple, and they're saying, well, Hodge was very political. He was very political, but he kept most of it very private. And these fellows, whether it's Guchar or Hoffaker or whoever, even recently writing on Hodge, done like I done, you go to Princeton, you read these things. But because Hodge is saying this to his brother Hugh, doesn't mean he's saying it to the world. We're seeing it as historians. And sometimes they'll say, well, Hodge was... Now, there's other evidence, and there's the talk of students, that Hodge actually kept a lot of things pretty quiet. And what Hodge said to his brother about Andrew Jackson, he never, I can guarantee you, there's no evidence that he said this to students in a classroom. He said he was an imbecile to his brother. He didn't say that publicly. So, yeah, he was quite interested in politics, but he was circumspect. And he said anything to his brother, but that was his brother. So, I'm going to wrap it up here. Pastor Lucero is looking daggers at me. Not really. But I'm skipping a lot of stuff here, but you're not sure how these things are going to work out. So the Presbyterian Church was quite committed, as we said here, to an institutional separation of church and state, and adopted principles then in 1789, when, just to rehearse our history, 1706, First Presbytery, 1617, First Synod, 1729, the Adopting Act. There will be a test here. And then 1789, the First General Assembly. And that's where they're going to adopt the Confession of Faith, not saying we take exception to chapters 20 and 23, particularly that address these matters with respect to the civil magistrate. We're going to change this, okay? So they changed it. They modified. They adapted to the American context. But they also, in their form of church government, picking up things particularly from that second book of discipline in Scotland, they set forth a series, and this was printed all throughout the 19th century for a very long time in the form of government. This was what was adopted in 1789. And chapter 1 of the form of government opens with these words, so you're getting an idea about the Presbyterian Church here and some of the difference. The Presbyterian Church in the United States of America is presenting to the Christian public the system of union and the form of government and discipline which they have adopted, have thought proper to state by way of introduction a few of the general principles by which they've been governed in the formation of the plan. And then they set forth these 8 preliminary principles that guided them in the working out of their church polity. First of all, they said, God alone is the Lord of the conscience, has left it free from the doctrine and commandments of men. They're quoting there from the Westminster Confession, chapter 20, which are in anything contrary to His word or beside it in matters of faith and worship, end quote. Therefore, they consider the rights of private judgment in all matters, and this is the American Presbyterian Church, 1789. This is a whole church saying this. Private judgment in all matters that respect religion as universal and inalienable. They do not even wish to see any religious constitution aided by the civil power, further than may be necessary for protection and security, and at the same time be equal and common to all others. 2, that in perfect consistency with the above principle of common right, every Christian church or union or association of particular churches is entitled to declare the terms of admission into its own communion and the qualifications of its ministers and members, as well as the whole system of its internal government. You might say, well, when wasn't that the case? Anytime you have the church over the state, and you'd have that in Holland, the church didn't get to say who came to communion. That's too important for the church to decide, Erastianism says. Partly because of how it had been abused by Rome. Rome had a very political use of discipline. So that makes it say, well, the state's going to have this. It's too important for the church to have it. But see, that's not the right reaction. This church needs to do it rightly, not politically. And it says, as well as the whole system of its internal government, which Christ has appointed. Christ has appointed it. that in the exercise of this right they may notwithstanding err in making the terms of communion either too lax or too narrow. Yet even in this case they do not infringe upon the liberty or the rights of others, but only make an improper use of their own. In other words, if a church is too strict, that's their error. I mean, they're going to have to answer for it. The state doesn't get to step in and say, or that's what they're saying here. So it goes on. I'd like to read all these to you, but they're not all quite as relevant. I want to read the 7th and the 8th as well to just kind of wrap it up. That all church power, whether exercised by the body in general or in the way of representation by delegated authority, is only ministerial and declarative. That is to say, that the Holy Scriptures are the only rule of faith, and manners, that no church judicatory ought to pretend to make laws to bind the conscience in virtue of their own authority, and that all their decisions should be founded upon the revealed will of God. Now, though it will easily be admitted that all synods and councils may err through the frailty inseparable from humanity, yet there is much greater danger from the usurped claim of making laws than from the right of judging upon laws already made and common to all who profess the gospel, although this right, as necessity requires in the present state, be lodged with fallible men. Lastly, that if the preceding scriptural and rational principles be steadfastly adhered to, the rigor and strictness of its discipline will contribute to the glory and happiness of any church, since ecclesiastical discipline must be purely moral or spiritual in its object, and not attended with any civil effects. It can derive no force whatever but from its own justice, the approbation of an impartial public, and the countenance and blessing of the great head of the Church Universal. Now, I need to be clear here. I want to be clear here. I'm not saying I disagree with this, but I'm saying to you, I speak to you this as a historian. I'm reporting to you what's happened. This is the American Presbyterian Church. You may not like it. I mean, I suppose if someone is of a theonomic stripe, particularly, or an Erastian stripe, they're not going to like the way this sounds. But that is the American Presbyterian Church. So I'm giving this to you not at this point. I can speak as a theologian, but I'm speaking as a church historian to make clear to you what happened here. If you think that this is wrong, well, the American church has been going wrong pretty much from the beginning in this. I mean, it's been going wrong for a long time. So that at least needs to be understood. So that's something about the Presbyterians coming here and starting off and, by God's grace, continuing on. So I think we're probably supposed to be at the break, but we're doing okay? Okay. Well, let's see here. Dr. Hart is supposed to be speaking in 2 minutes. No, not quite. Are there any questions that I could answer that are of that more immediate sort that the pastor mentioned? Yes, sir. No, it was not. No, it was what it was primarily. That would be sort of an after effect. What it was primarily. Good question. Do I need to repeat the question? The question was what led to the scruple in 1729 that's going to get sort of enshrined in 1789 when they change it altogether, with chapters 20 and 23 with regards to the state and the relationship there. The scruple, I think, largely was the experience of and the perception of having suffered under that, of being convinced certainly that Erastianism was not biblical, that the state is not over the church, and that even an established church, from their experience, had problems and difficulties. See, because the established church in Britain was the Anglican church. Of course, you had in Scotland the Presbyterian church. But just that those who came over tended to be, particularly some of the Ulsterites, the so-called Scots-Irish, of the view that this was problematic from the standpoint of where it would lead the church, of how it would cramp the church, that the history was not a happy one here. that it was better and there were, the New England influence was certainly in that way, although they had their own kind of establishment. So it's not a neat, clean thing. It's not a neat, clean thing. But there was a lot of talk about possibly an established church in America, you see. There was talks about getting a bishop or bishops from the Anglican Church. There's all kinds of things that happen in colonial life, in the development of the history there, that at times look like that there could be an established church imposed from the English. You had, for example, in Virginia, you had an established church, but you didn't have a bishop there. You had a commissary in Williamsburg who ruled on the behalf of the bishop. The bishop who was in charge of all the colonies was the Bishop of London. You had Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of York. Those are the two heads. The primate is, of course, Canterbury. The third-ranking bishop is Bishop of London. And because the London Company and all of those things sort of came out of London, the settlements both north and south, everything that was Anglican came under the Bishop of London. But many Americans were very happy. They didn't want a bishop to come over here because they figured, if a bishop comes, we're just going to be that much further. They sort of, back to the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, where 1604-5, they said to James I, they didn't want episcopacy. And he said, no bishop, no king, meaning you get rid of episcopacy, you're going to get rid of the king. I think some of the Puritans might have said at that time, well, man, that's not such a bad idea. No bishop, no king. Okay, we'll go for that. No, but so it had to do really with authority structures, persecution, and they felt there was an opportunity to do something better and to have a clearer, Calvin, 1538, he gets banished from Geneva. Why? Well, he stood in front of the table. He said, you'll have to run me through with a sword to get to the table. Because the town council had said, this is who takes communion. And Calvin said, these people are not taking communion. You don't have a right to tell them. I'm the minister here. And with a consistory, we'll say who takes communion. And basically his friends sort of spirited him off, like, you're going to get killed. And he got thrown out of Geneva. And he was, very happy to leave Geneva. He was like, good riddance. I don't like this place. So this struggle was always going on, and here was sort of here was a place and a time where there was an opportunity to do something different. A lot of times it gets shown as, well, here everything was so different here in America. Yes, it did become different, but that's not to say that there wasn't, among a lot of churchmen, a lot of chafing under this various kinds of stately strictures. I was probably way too long, sorry. That gentleman there has a question. Yes, sir. Correct. My point was more than that. That was sort of an earlier point. To read those preliminary principles, I wish I could have read them all to you. You got a bit of 8. It was to really show you sort of where the American church is in its thinking at this point. And they're saying, we don't want an established church anywhere. In fact, they've developed here, along some lines that you're suggesting maybe even, to say, this liberty isn't just something that's a bad sort of thing we take exception to. This is what we believe. This freedom of conscience for all here is what we believe in. It's not something we're apologizing for. We're not saying, oh, forgive us for not believing in an establishment. They're saying, we don't believe it, and we're happy to say it. And so, again, I understand these issues are still going on. Because you have historians like Mark Knoll, just to take an example, who, and rightly so, historians play this sort of role, sort of like Dr. Phil. You know how Dr. Phil, something goes on and he says, how's that working for you? Well, Mark Knoll wants to say that to the American church. How's that working for you? And he means many things by that. He doesn't mean just that, but he does mean total disestablishment. That's part of what he means. So he says, how's that working for you? So that, I can, as a theologian and as somebody who's a biblical exegete, say, I think this is good. But as a historian, I have to ask these questions, and I have to think about this. I can't just assume that it's all worked out in the best way here. Maybe it hasn't worked out in the best way here. And the historian has some different concerns than the theologian. I'm not saying there's no kind of overlap. I appreciate some of the things in John Fay's just recent book about what is history. It just came out not long ago. And I think he gets some things, and I think he misses some things too. I think he's not as candid about everything as he should be, because he wants to separate things, but then he also seems to want to push his own kind of political agenda in a very sly way. So, people always do that. It's the best way to do is to proclaim objectivity while I'm trying to push an agenda at the same time. It's a lot of fun, yeah. Okay, thank you.